So our kids are in trouble. Our kids are in a lot of trouble. I'm going to tell you about a little trick. There's a lot of tricks being played on our kids. Let me tell you about a little trick. So, they're on the internet. They've got their TikTok. They've got whatever it is, whatever the social media of the day is. It used to be Tumblr. They watch TV. Maybe they're watching Disney. Maybe not anymore. Maybe they're watching CNN Plus. Probably not. They're probably watching Disney Plus, and you have to ask what the plus is for. So they watch this stuff, and then they're getting these ideas, whether it's critical race theory ideas, whether it's queer theory ideas, gender ideology ideas, whether it's disability studies or fat studies or all of these other dimensions of this identity Marxism fed to them, kind of taking them off of their base. And you say, well, that's the entertainment industry. What are you going to do? That's social media. What are you going to do? And so they go to school. And what does the school do? Does the school try to keep them level? No. The school accelerates it. And when you ask the school, why on earth are you doing this? They say, well, they're already being exposed to it. They have the internet. They're watching porn anyway, so we have to teach them about pornography in high school. In fact, we should show them pornography. We'll watch pornography together. Because they're already seeing it, so we need responsible adults like us to bring it to them. And now you see the trick. You have these different domains within society playing off of one another to create this need that then they fulfill, but it's all bogus. So our kids are in a lot of trouble. They're being bombarded from every direction. They're supposed to be innocent. Queer theory, as we'll talk about, explicitly challenges the idea of childhood innocence. It says that childhood innocence is something that's afforded to some children and not others. Those children you might call bourgeois, if you were a Marxist. They have access to a special kind of property called innocence that other people are excluded from. This creates a dynamic in society. And so we have to overthrow childhood innocence. We have to rethink, reimagine what innocence actually means. And so our innocent children are being bombarded by this, at home through their entertainment, probably not through you, through their entertainment, through their social media, whatever it happens to be, and then they're going to school and they're getting it reinforced. And this is a catastrophe. There's nothing else to say about it. It is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe as it's happening, and it's a catastrophe in the making, where it's going. I just saw a video, I think it was from New Jersey, but I'm not 100% sure, of a crowd of, looks like older teenagers running through a mall, causing mayhem, clearly spouting critical race theory ideas, going berserk. And the first thing that I saw this, I put it on Twitter, I retweeted, and the first thing I said was, this is the American Red Guard. So what's happening to our children, what's happening in our schools is a reproduction of what Mao Zedong did, and Sloan said that this morning. So I'm gonna have to talk to you about a few different concepts today that you're probably not familiar with. I'll try not to fire hose you too much. But we're gonna have to talk about Mao Zedong. We're gonna have to talk about queer theory, because it's a little bit unfamiliar. We're gonna have to talk about what's happening in education, particularly education theory. And hopefully I can keep it kind of to those topics, but this is gonna be a little heavy. We're gonna talk a lot about, Wade brought up the idea of the slippery slope. I wanna just point out to you that we can't understand queer theory without understanding the slippery slope. But we'll come to queer theory after Maoism. But the thing is that every woke slope is slippery. Every single one, and we're gonna cover why that is. And so, just to give you an example, Wade gave a couple of examples of this slippery slope with the thruples and all of this. So we heard about the dog paper. Dog parks are a petri dish of canine rape culture, so on and so forth. Therefore, we have to train men the way that we train dogs in order to stop rape culture. That was the thesis of the award-winning paper that we wrote. Well, we decided that, you can't get more, my friend says you can't take 2 bites out of the same cherry. So we can't write fake papers again and get the attention. But we thought, wow, if we did medical journals, that might get people's attention though. Because the medical journals, New England Journal of Medicine, for example, the Lancet, etc., are publishing this kind of stuff routinely. So we thought, we'll go after medical journals. Turns out, we didn't know how hard it is to get published in a medical journal, not because of the quality of what you have to write, which was obviously degraded, and we know how to play that game, but because of they actually do check their credentials. Turns out they don't want non-medical professionals publishing in medical journals. Other academia was a little softer back in the day. So we actually wrote 2 2 fake medical papers that never went anywhere, and we've given up, so I can talk about them now. And this is last year we wrote them. And so both of the papers have already come true. It's exactly the future facts that Wade was talking about. One was that we argued that we need birthing equity, and that birthing equity would be based off of Black and Indigenous birthing persons of color. And the punchline was, to get birth equity, we need to encourage white abortion. That last part hasn't quite come out explicitly. All the rest has. Another one, we said that we need to stop referring to the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. We should call it the hypocritical oath, and that we should do away with the Hippocratic Oath, and we should do harm proportionally to the equity we want to achieve as doctors. And this is borderline come true as well, that they are now challenging the Hippocratic Oath and saying that it is hypocritical at its foundation. They haven't yet discovered that the first time that primary non serum, which is the Latin expression of it, it was written was in a book. This is what our paper did. It's in a book from the 1860s or so, and a British doctor wrote it for the first time, and he has this story in the book where there were these colonial Indians, and he chased them down and talked about how they're like terrible people and all this, so obviously it's racist. So they haven't discovered that yet, but they'll get there, don't worry. Every woke slope is slippery. Even encouraging white abortion is a thing that will be happening soon, if it's not already happening somewhere. White castration, you cannot possibly make up something too extreme for them to go there. And they are totally accelerating. But this is kind of part and parcel with how Maoism works. I've been telling people, we've all got kind of a sense now, I don't want to talk about critical race theory a lot. I feel like I've said the last word on that. It's race Marxism, the last 2 words, I suppose. That's all it is. It's Marxism recreated using race instead of economic class. I talked to a Marxist about it last week, and I convinced him that they stole the Marxist engine and put it in a jalopy, and he decided that was actually a pretty good description in the end. So I don't want to talk a lot about that, but I do have to talk about it to get you to understand how the Maoism works. And so what Mao did is, as Sloan said this morning, is that Mao came out with this campaign to destroy the 4 olds in society. This was during the Cultural Revolution, which was from 1966 to 1976 when Mao died. Before that, actually, though, critical race theory was used in China to undermine the Nationalist Party, which was called the Kuomintang. So it's often abbreviated the KMT. The Chinese Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek had to be undermined, and it turned out the CCP infiltrated it, and they used literally critical race theory to do it. They said that what the Nationalist Party was trying to do was trying to create a unified Chinese identity. They called it Huarun. Huarun means Chinese person. It's kind of a slang term for a Chinese person. And they said, there are 56 racial identities in China. One is the Han race, and then there are the 55 minority races. And they said they're trying to erase all of you minority races and make you all Han. Just like we're trying to erase all the people of color, minority races, and make them all like white people. They have to have good work ethic, for example. It makes them like white people. And they use this to destabilize the Nationalist Party, and that's how the CCP rose to power. Then they tried this Great Leap Forward thing. Mao got kicked out of power because he killed millions of people. It was a complete disaster. China was set back. And then he comes back with the Cultural Revolution to depose the people who kicked him out of power in 1966. And what he did was he wanted to destroy the 4 olds of society: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ways of thinking. And so he unleashed young people. University students are easy to radicalize, didn't take too much work, and then children to do this, to destroy the 4 olds. They're the new, they're young, and we're going to use you to destroy the old. So what they ended up doing was going and destroying temples, destroying the artwork, destroying old cultural artifacts of China, like Chinese martial arts, Chinese medicine, and so on. Went and just systematically destroyed it. They came home and they beat up their parents. They beat up their grandparents. They attacked their teachers and professors if they were labeled with the wrong kind of politics, but more specifically with the wrong kind of identity. Turns out that Mao used identity politics that he groomed children into to create a Revolutionary Red Guard out of people under roughly the age of 25 to destroy society so that he could secure his power. That's what he did. So he separated Chinese people into 10 identity categories. 5 of them he labeled as black, and those were bad, and 5 of them he labeled as red, and those were good. Red is for communism. The 5 black identities were landlord, rich farmer, sounding very Soviet at that point, counter-revolutionaries, people that are fighting back against what was happening, bad influences, we call them domestic terrorists from the Department of Justice today, and right-wingers, just cutting right to the bone. Right wing, black identity. The 5 red identities were peasant, laborer, those you couldn't easily become, but they were given glorified status under the Marxist-Leninist ideology that Mao was employing. So you had peasant, you had laborer, and then the rest are all basically the same thing. You had revolutionaries, you had revolutionary cadres, and you had revolutionary martyrs. So people who played on the side of his revolution or died in its cause, those got red identities. And you say, well, what good is a red identity if you die? Well, it bestows upon your children as well. So if you had a black identity, your children had black identities. If you had a red identity, your children had red identities, or might, depending on what they did. And all you have to do to radicalize kids, anybody who has little kids knows, is you offer them like a piece of candy to turn in their parents, and they will. It's really easy. All you have to actually do is offer some kids special treatment, and other kids you exclude from special treatment, or maybe psychologically abuse them and make their life miserable. That's all it takes. Some kids get to wear a special hat. They get to put a feather in their hat. They get to wear a little badge. They get to have a nicer lunch. They get to sit at the cool kids' table. They get 2 recesses. It's not hard to create conditions where the fairness impulse of children which is, as every parent knows, is a bit strong. The fairness impulse of children can be weaponized to radicalize them. So if you happen to be, say, a landlord, your child has a black identity at school, gets treated like crap, other kids are getting treated good, but if he rats you out to the government or beats you up, he gets a red identity too, and he gets a special treatment. And that's basically all that it takes. So what's going on with critical race theory and queer theory, or the gender ideology, or trans, whichever thing you want to latch it onto, it's all the same thing. What's going on with that is they're creating a 1-2 punch. I saw a long time ago, I was trying to figure out what the relationship between critical race theory and queer theory was, and I was like, it's like a monster with 2 fists. And so I did some boxing back in the day. You set them up with a left jab and you hit them with a right cross to knock them out. And that left jab, that probing little punch that probably isn't going to knock a guy down unless he's got a glass jaw, that's critical race theory. You start telling them that their racial identity is messed up. That if they're white, they're associated with all of these worst crimes of history, that they've got the original sin of racism of this country built into the very skin color because they happen to benefit from it because they were born that way. They're the worst kind of person, really. They're associated with the worst people in all of history. If they're a minority race, black in particular, well, if they're thinking for themselves rather than being a political activist, then they're selling out the cause. They're a terrible person. This is what they actually teach in critical race theory. And that sets them up. There's your jab. And you get a lot of activists out of that. You can get out of that black identity by becoming a red identity, an ally. That's what allyship is. It's adopting a red identity. It's joining the revolutionary cadre. You're an ally now. But you can never do your allyship well enough. You can become politically black, as Nicole Hannah-Jones put it. That's the architect of the 1619 Project. It's different than being racially black. She said it in a tweet she then deleted very quickly because she gave away the game. She said the quiet part out loud. So you give people this pathway just with critical race theory. But the right cross that's going to knock your kid out is queer theory. You tell them that they're terrible because of their skin color, so they have to become an ally. Their allyship is weak, they're not cool, they're not interesting, they're the most boring kid in class. They don't get any special treatment from their friends. They don't get affirming care or affirming activity from their teachers unless they become pansexual, or demisexual, or asexual, or gray sexual, or queer in general, or trans. All you have to do is say that you don't think that you're a boy anymore, or that you don't think you're a girl anymore. Or, as I talked to one young woman a number of years ago, she said that she was pansexual, and I said, what does that mean? She said, well, it means I'm attracted to everybody no matter who they are. And I said, have you kissed a girl? And she was like, ew, why would I do that? You put these things together, and what you're seeing is they're adopting politicized identities that they don't realize are politicized identities because it gives them status. I talked to a young man in Southern California one day. I had the opportunity to do a thing at Chapman University, and then I had another thing to do in Los Angeles, and this young man at Chapman volunteered to drive me the 2 hours up to Hollywood from Orange County. So we talked the whole way, and he's, college sophomore or something. He's just out of high school. And I'm like, what's it like in high school right now in California? And he says, oh yeah, you get your yearbook, you go home, you write everybody's pronouns on it, you go home, you gotta go in and change them, you gotta keep up with them, because you're going around every single day and you're using everybody's pronouns with them, and anybody who gets one wrong is just gonna get made fun of all the time. That's all you do. That's all we do. You can't be the kid who doesn't know all 700 other kids in your grade's pronouns. So you go home and study pronouns, not math, not reading, whatever, all day. That's what he told me. The reason is because that gets you into the red identity. And the point of creating these revolutionary cadres out of politicized identities is to destabilize your children, to separate them from their parents, to separate them from their religion, to separate them from their nation, and separate them from their culture. It is to sever those pillars of culture being transmitted from one generation to the next. It is to take your children away from you, first psychologically and emotionally, and then second physically, because that's what they've architected now. If you don't give your children affirming care at home, this is another little trick, by the way, they set up. This is my war that I've now started to wage on something called the Trevor Project. If you don't give them affirming care, if you aren't affirming their identity, then you're secretly abusing them. They have all kinds of secret ways that they can talk to people at school, and you'll never find out. Be affirmed there, be socially transitioned at school, maybe even led to physical transition, being given access to hormones, being signed up for examples of possibly getting surgery. And what they'll do is they'll say, well, how do your parents feel about this? And my parents would hate it. Well, we don't have to tell them. And the Trevor Project is a whole anti-suicide campaign online, one of the biggest anti-suicide campaigns online that's designed around that objective. And when people try to defend the Trevor Project, which is pushing people in these directions, we've got to declare our conflicts of interest, is also funded by the pharmaceutical companies that sell the hormones, as it turns out. When they do this, they say, well, we have to, because these kids can't talk to their parents, because that's the problem. We have to have this. So they create and manufacture the same problem. They pretend there's a problem, pretend there's a demand. They manufacture the demand and then serve that demand. It's called selling snake oil. But you're selling literally puberty blockers to children who will be sterilized by them, who will never grow adult genitals, who will never have sex, whose genitals may atrophy. If you put a young woman, a girl, on testosterone long enough, her vagina may actually abscess. You can kill them. They will not have children. They may never experience things like orgasm. They will never have a healthy sexual identity as adults. Whether they want to be gay or straight, doesn't matter. And this is what they're grooming them into. And this is the way that they're doing it. And the point is to destabilize them and to separate them from you. To separate them from you, but also faith. I'm not particularly religious myself, but I can understand that it's a terrible thing when the child comes home and says, I'm demisexual, and you're like, what in the world's that? That's not in the Bible, and they're like, the Bible's obsolete. The Bible is an oppressive book. We don't live by that. That's old news. That's out. That's not American values. Well, America's been wrong this whole time. It's been oppressive to people like me, and you don't understand. You don't understand, Dad. You don't understand. It's different now. And you can just see that the goal is to actually take your children and separate them from you, from their faith, from their American heritage, from their culture, from the nation they live in, and to set them up in a politicized identity that's designed to go out and destroy all of those old things in culture, like old religion, like old parents, like old ideas, like old art, like statues of Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson that have to go in the lake. That's the objective. So the kids can't know who they are, they can't understand what they are, but they know that everything that's come before them is terrible and has to be destroyed. That's the objective. That's what Mao did, and that's what they're doing in schools right now, using critical race theory and queer theory as a 1-2 punch. So, we're all familiar with critical race theory now. It's race Marxism. Done. Ta-da. I was doing this kind of a little thing with a group in Oklahoma recently, and the state attorney general was there, and I said, well, we got to talk about queer theory, and he just blurts out, what is queer theory? And I realized nobody knows what queer theory is. Now, I don't know, maybe I have to have a mea culpa moment here. A few years ago, after I did these fake papers and I realized that this was the end of Western civilization, somebody better talk about it. It's like I went into a room and stood before 3 doors, and I didn't know which door to open. On one hand, I had critical race theory. On another hand, I had feminism and queer theory. On another hand, I had critical education theory. And at the time, I had to pick one. And I was reading some of this stuff, and it was like white fragility, white silence, white anger, white rage, white this, white that, white the other thing, white everything, white mathematics, white empiricism. I was like, wow, that really grates on how proud we are as Americans to have overcome racism to the degree that we have. So I'm going to go after critical race theory. And I guess that was fortuitous. Maybe that's been the right answer, I don't know. But it meant that I did not go after education theory or queer theory, which I'm now trying to do simultaneously, which is hard because they're each 2 gigantic domains. So what is queer theory? The shortest way to put it is that queer theory is a war against the normal. I could say it's just queer Marxism. Ta-da, we're done. Because queer means abnormal, right? And so some people have access to a special kind of bourgeois property called normalcy, and other people do not. They're excluded from that by the system of considering some things normal and considering other things abnormal. So what you have to do is you have to get the people who are considered abnormal to awaken to a consciousness of their abnormality and the injustice of being classified as abnormal by a society that favors normalcy and wage war on the very concept of the normal and undermine it. It's queer Marxism. It'd be weird to call it abnormal Marxism, but that's the idea. That's all queer theory is. Queer theory really kind of is, we talk about slippery slope, queer theory is the slippery slope of feminism, of a particular kind of feminism. There are lots of them. One of our other fake papers, by the way, was a rewrite of a chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf, 12th chapter of Hitler's Mein Kampf. We had a guy from Norway come out and say, well, that's not a very bad, maybe Sweden, sorry, who came out and said, that's not a bad chapter of Mein Kampf. Like, there's some good ones in there. And that's one of these tricks where you deny the context of where that chapter exists. Chapter 12 comes after chapter 11, which comes after chapter 10, which comes after all the other chapters before that. And so what you have is Hitler explaining why he's getting madder and madder and madder, first at the Marxists and then at the Jews, because he identified them as one and the same. And then later, he starts railing on the Jews, and that's chapter 11. If you want to find the chapter that's properly, truly racist and anti-Semitic to the hilt in Mein Kampf, it's chapter 11 of volume 1. Chapter 12 is we need a movement to solve this problem. That's the not bad chapter, apparently, according to this brain genius. And so we took that chapter and we erased the word our movement, or the words our movement, and replaced it with intersectional feminism. And then we railed on this other type of feminism called choice feminism, which is that a woman making her own independent choices makes her a feminist because she's a free and independent agent in the world and can do whatever she wants. A strong independent woman don't need no man. Because they hate choice feminism, because they want Marxist solidarity around feminism. But ultimately what we're talking about is all of feminism that's rooted in social constructivist ideas. Social constructivist ideas is the idea that, say, gender is a social construct, or race is a social construct, or whatever, that society has created social constructs, which is a Marxist concept, of how society is supposed to be ordered and how people are going to be placed into that society according to what class they fall into, their class position. So for feminists who took up the social constructivist argument, what they argued was that gender is a social construct. I might be a man, or you might be a woman, but I shouldn't feel constrained to have to be manly, and you shouldn't have to be constrained to feel womanly. I can be an effeminate man, and that's fine. You can be a masculine woman or a butch lesbian, as most of the theorists were, and that's fine. You're no less a woman, I'm no less a man, based on how I present, based on the gender roles that I adopt for myself, based on the gender roles or sex roles that I'm cast into. And they waged war on the existing society in terms of so-called sex roles. Men go get the jobs, men go do this, men go do that, women stay at the home, women raise the children, women are to be meek and something, blah, 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 and not speak over people. I don't know, all these different things that they said were the socially constructed enforcers of what it meant to be male and what it meant to be female that constrained an awful lot of people who didn't feel like that fit them as an individual. And they had, something of a point. But the problem is when you go into social constructivism, you're on a slippery slope. Every woke slope is slippery because it's in la-la land. So here's why it's really slippery though. If I say gender is a social construct, but sex is not a social construct, underlying all of this, I'm still a man, you're still a woman, that's what it is. Somebody sometime down the line named Gail Rubin in 1984 in an essay called Thinking Sex is going to say maybe we need to think differently. Maybe the reason gender is socially constructed is because sex is actually socially constructed too. Judith Butler is going to echo this in her kind of magnum opuses in 1990 and 1993 and say, well, where does gender even come from? Well, it comes from sex. So maybe sex is socially constructed. And then if you're a feminist who says, no, I'm a woman, but you're not going to tell me what it is to be a woman. But I'm still a woman because I'm a biologist and I know. Because otherwise I wouldn't. Which is a transphobic statement, by the way. What your queer theorist, your national queer theorist is going to say is, you've left an awful lot of status quo on the table. You cannot leave status quo on the table, so the slope has to slide. You are being a conservative. You're not willing to go as far as I'm willing to go. If I'm going to say sex is a social construct, just like gender is a social construct, then I've taken the argument further, and the reason you won't is because you have something to lose. You have a special kind of property called normalcy that you have to lose that is oppressing me. There's a violence, Judith Butler. I call her the fairy godmother of queer theory. There's the violence of categorization itself. So now we don't have doctors observing the sex of a baby, they're assigning sex at birth. They are doing a violence of categorizing that person regardless of how that infant will grow up to feel. And it's considered a violence. It is a war on the idea of normal, and anybody who tries to say, this is why the slope is slippery, anybody who tries to say, yeah, I'm with you to this point, but you can go no further, is a conservative, is a counter-revolutionary, is a right-winger. A radical feminist is a right-winger now. And of course, that's one of your black identities under the Maoist construction. So those people have to be destroyed. They can have a red identity by becoming queer. That's what queer theory is. Queer theory is a relentless war on the normal. It is to believe that everything, especially with regard to sex, gender, and sexuality, is socially constructed, fluid, malleable. I'll give you a quote from a woman, I think. No one knows. But the person's name is Hannah Dyer. Hannah Dyer is a leading queer theorist in education. She specializes in early childhood education. I think she with an X, specializes in early childhood education, early childhood development psychology from a lens of queer theory. And she has this paper that she wrote about queer futurity in the innocence of children, where she argues that the innocence of children is a social construct that maintains this idea of normalcy and needs to be abolished, needs to be destroyed. And she says a lot of people make the mistake of believing that queer theory is about creating stable LGBTQ identities, but nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, it is about making sure that those identities stay fluid, that they never become stable. And the reason is because the Marxists, through the middle part of the 20th century, really starting in the 60s, going forward, realized that the problem that keeps Marxism from getting in play in the West is stability. The working class became financially successful, became a middle class, and they became stable, and they became conservative, and they became counter-revolutionary. That's the words of Herbert Marcuse. So they are no longer a revolutionary class. So you have to look elsewhere. And where did he say to look? He said to the ghetto populations, the racial minorities, the sexual minorities, the feminists, the unemployed, and the outsiders, and the radicals. And we'll get to them by radicalizing students to bring the message to them. So they had to abandon stability entirely. First, they abandoned the stability of the working class within an advanced capitalist system because it delivers the goods. Later, when the queer theorists got a hold of these ideas, they had to abandon the stability of categories of sex, gender, sexuality, romantic inclination. They separate those things. Mental health status, physical health status, ability status, fat status, and on and on and on and on. You have to wage war on the normal. That's queer theory. And the reason is because you make sure that nobody has a stable sense of self. But somebody who doesn't have a stable sense of self is easily groomed. So now we turn to the third door, which is critical education theory. I'm going to talk, this is the first time I've really talked at length publicly about critical education theory, better known as critical pedagogy. I'm not going to go all the way back to the school reform movement, which precedes this, the John Dewey and all of that. I did not pick up my research there. I don't know enough about it. I don't want to open my mouth and say something incorrect. I started in the middle of this story with a man named Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is a Brazilian Marxist, in fact, a liberation theologian, which is a Marxist posing as a Catholic. So he's a very religious man that has had more influence on our education system than probably anybody else, except maybe John Dewey. Paulo Freire's ideas in 1985, after his book, The Politics of Education, was brought to the United States and promoted by his disciple, Henry Giroux, became the most influential in education. Every college of education teaches Paulo Freire's most famous book, which is called The Pedagogy of the Oppressed from 1970, which was basically ignored in North America for 15 years until The Politics of Education came out. So what Paulo Freire is the root of groomer schools, believe it or not. And the reason is because he had a number of different things that are going to sound very familiar to you, but the last one that I'm going to talk about is the one where you get to the grooming. First, I want to tell you what his method was. The first thing he did was that he made education and knowledge itself and literacy into a Marxist concept. When I say made it into a Marxist concept, I mean it's something that's being understood in a conflict theory, the way that Marx laid out a conflict theory of economic class. What that means is the literate have a special kind of property bestowed upon them, which is called literacy, or formal education is the term you hear a lot now. The illiterate and the uneducated are excluded from full participation in society by the fact that society has structured itself around valuing education and literacy. This is an injustice. And who got to decide what counts as being educated? Who got to decide what counts as being literate? It's not whether or not you can read. People who are literate and people who are educated decided that they're going to get to decide who's educated and who's literate. So they did this purposefully to exclude peasants, to exclude the underclasses of society, to keep them from rising up. And again, there are historical cases where there's some truth to this. From what I understand, the French language is impossible to spell because the nobles didn't want the peasants to learn how to read and write. So there is some historical truth to these kinds of arguments. But of course, Freire takes it to the extreme. What he says then is that the point of education cannot be about teaching literacy, which, as we heard with the work ethic from Wade, you can't teach people to succeed in the existing system because that upholds the existing system. You can't teach people to have a good work ethic because that's white supremacy and it upholds white supremacy culture. You can't teach people to succeed in the existing system because it upholds the existing system. Instead, you don't teach them literacy, you teach them political literacy. He explicitly says that. But by political literacy, he means Marxist political literacy. That the entire system is orchestrated against certain people, to exclude them, to marginalize them and hold them outside, where their perspective, which is the only true perspective, can't be brought to the center from which it has access to power and can reshape the entire society. He said the way that we're going to get there is this model that he called generative words. If you have kids and you've looked at their vocabulary homework or you've read through the math examples like Wade gave, you know, it's funny because Wade said, the white man has $5 million, the black woman has $0, what's the difference in how much money they have? I mean, this is exactly what and how they do this. They tuck these examples in, and it's kind of funny because if you were like, black men are involved in, 850 gangs and white men are involved in 2 gangs, what's the difference? They would see the politics immediately if you did that. But when they do it the other way around, in service of their ideology, they pretend they can't see the politics that they're tucking into these lessons. But this is how they do this. The generative ideas or generative concepts method of Paulo Freire is the idea, which is you don't teach literacy by, say, giving people basic sentences. If you grew up in the United States, you probably saw a Dick. You probably saw a Jane. You probably saw Dick and Jane. Maybe you saw Dick run. Maybe you saw Jane run, and maybe you saw Dick and Jane run. And you learn to sound out these simple words. His context is a little bit different. It was in Brazil, their language is a little bit different, but he said this teaches people disconnected sentences that are not engaging to their lives. How many times have you heard that that the justification for the stupid freaking programs they're putting in your kid's school is that it increases engagement, culturally relevant teaching anybody. It increases engagement to make everybody come up and deliver whatever in a rap song. I don't know how it increases engagement, but they claim it increases engagement. And that was Freire's argument. So you don't teach them sentences in Portuguese like Eva saw it great, which is like Eva something, I don't remember how to say saw in Portuguese, una uva. So you have Eva, una uva, it's like little, same kind of thing, see Dick and Jane. You don't do that. Instead you teach them words like favela, which means slum. You teach them words like struggle, misery, starvation. You teach them concepts that are generative to their lives. The second thing he said you do is you teach them this in a particular way. You teach them this through a method he called codification and decodification. So what you do is you show them a picture or a video of a slum. It's other people in a slum. You show them that image. You have them read, 800 books about the civil rights movement and some, black kid that had a rough ride or something, some emotive, pathological story about Stonewall and how the gays were mistreated or whatever. You get these evocative images and you say, look how terrible that was. So first, you show them an abstract image of what a slum looks like, or what gay abuse looks like, or what racism looks like, and then you say, what's wrong with that? How do you think they felt? And there's your social emotional learning. How do you think they felt? How do you think those black people felt to be excluded from the restaurants, to have to use a different bathroom, to have to use a different water fountain? How do you think they felt? And you get them going into the emotional side of that. And you get them to start saying, well, what's the problem here? And you get them to start thinking in terms of a system of racism and all the damage that it does. And then you go to the decodification part. So you codify, you problematize, that was his word for it. You've probably heard that word a few times. And then you decodify, which is that you say, that image you just looked at of the slum, that's you. You live in that slum. And all those problems you just learned to identify apply to you. And you make it real. As a matter of fact, he even says, echoing another very famous, but not famous enough philosopher, Hegel, he says that you give them the codification in the abstract, you problematize with the negative, and then you make it concrete by decodifying it and making it real to their lives, which is exactly the Hegelian dialectic, laid out in new words so that you won't detect what it is when you do it. So this is how you're supposed to teach. So your math lesson should be taught in terms of generative statistics. Your reading lesson should be taught in terms of generative stories. Your vocabulary lesson is going to be filled. And I was just told by a school system in Middle Tennessee that this is, if you look at your kids' vocabulary lists, that there is a overwhelmingly disproportionate number of words that are negative. Misery, starvation, hunger, sadness, things like that in the vocabulary lists that they're having to learn. They're not learning just words, they're learning particular words that they're then going to talk about in social and emotional learning contexts. This is Freire's generative words concept, being delivered with social emotional learning through a codification, problematization, decodification program. So the last thing that Freire did, how do you do this? What's the method, as he called this, his dialogical method. Education, to be true education, has to be dialogical, which sounds like it's a very complicated thing. It means you engage in dialogue. In fact, it says the educator and the learner, not teacher and student, that reproduces a dynamic. That in fact makes the student the object of the educational process rather than an active participant in it, a subject, a knowing subject. He says what you're going to do is you're going to have the educator and the learner. Notice that shift in language again, by the way. You very rarely hear about teachers and students now. It's always educators and learners. The educator and the learner are going to engage in dialogue about the problems in their lives as equals. They're going to learn together, but the educator takes on a role of a facilitator. And the goal of the facilitator is to help them see through the codification, problematization, decodification process how their own lives are lives that either are stuck in oppression or reproduce oppression, rather than learning to read, rather than learning to do math. But we have a term for that, grooming. We have a term for that. It is grooming. The educator who is an adult and the child who is not are equals. Grooming. You break down that barrier between adulthood and childhood. The purpose is to raise a political literacy, to get them to see the world through a particular lens, a theoretical lens, if you will. Grooming. It is ideological grooming. Why is there so much sexual grooming? Why is there this argument? Do we use this obviously, sexually connotative word, grooming, or should we not use it? Well, because there's a long history of sexual grooming in Marxism, of children in particular. And a lot of people don't know this. I'm going to tell you about a couple of people that you may have not heard of. One I mentioned, Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse's probably least famous major work was a book in 1955 called Eros and Civilization. He tried to put Freudian psychoanalysis and Marxist theory together, and the whole point of the book is that we have to liberate the libido in order to achieve liberation. What he says is that Western society makes people suppress their sexual and active urges, actually technically their sexual and violent urges, to suppress those so that that energy can be transferred into productive work. So instead of sitting at home and, say, masturbating all day like the books at your kids' school teach them to do, you go get a job. He says that's a problem that reproduces capitalism. That's literally his argument. But that's in 1955. The real character, the real villain in this story for the Marxist sexual grooming story is a guy that most people have not heard of, a Hungarian by the name of George Lukács. It's the Hungarian spelling of George. And good luck spelling it. Like G-Y-O-R-G-Y or something with an umlaut on the O. So George Lukács was the deputy commissar of education in Bela Kun's short-lived Hungarian Soviet regime in 1919. It only lasted 4 months. Probably the reason it only lasted 4 months is he made a lot of parents really mad because he sexualized their kids. Because what George Lukács realized was that if you really want to separate one generation from the next, really want to tear a generation of children away from their religion and their nation and their culture and their parents, you sexualize them. If it happens to make them personality disordered along the way, all the better. Because they don't have a sense of stable identity and they weren't able to grow up in childhood innocence that allows them to go through the developmental stages correctly. So George Lukács knew that the sexualization of children in 1919 was a vehicle to creating a Marxist revolution in a Western country. This never went away. This was some of the inspiration for Herbert Marcuse when he's writing about the sexual liberation movement starting in 1955 with Eros and Civilization, and it's why they are so vigorously employing not just gender grooming, but also sex and sexuality grooming as well. And when you are separating children from their parents, to talk to them about sexual issues and to keep those secret, with an adult and a child, with an adult and a child who are now considered equals, you are grooming a child sexually. And that's why we have groomer schools. This is all Marxist subversion, meant to capture your children, to take them away from you. They will make this literal. I started to say this earlier, but my sinus infection made me forget it. They will make this literal. They will, when I said earlier that they will get this game going, and then they'll say, if your parents aren't supporting you, then you need this secret affirming care and the Trevor Project and all of this. This actually goes further, and they coach children in this. If you're not receiving that affirmation at home, your parents are abusing you. Your parents are abusing you. And under, say, California law, they can take your children from you. And they do. They do. I'll tell you a story. This should be, if we want to win politically, it should be on every major Spanish language outlet in Spanish, as detailed as possible. It's the story of Yeli Galdamez. No one's heard of this. Just a few years ago, her mother comes up from Peru, moves to California. Yeli, not too long later, I forget what name she adopted, starts identifying as a boy, keeps it a secret at the school. They don't tell her parents. Of course, there's also a language barrier making it more difficult. They start socially transitioning Yeli at school, but not at home. They keep it secret. Eventually, Yeli's like, I can't tell my parents. I can't tell my parents because they won't understand. It won't help, by the way, thank you. They won't understand, so ends up having Child Protective Services come in, takes Yeli out from her mother. She loses her kid, her child in her teen years. I think at 16. And at 19, Yeli, because the dichotomy, the false dichotomy they give you, the false choice they give you is you can have a trans kid or a dead kid. Well, at 19, Yeli walked in front of a train because the social transitioning and grooming she went through did not actually succeed in stopping her suicide. And this is 100% on the schools. that groomed her. Because groomer schools. Because affirmative care is grooming. I'll say that again. Affirmative care is a euphemism for grooming. It is not care. It is affirmative. It's affirmative in exactly the same way that everybody's standing up and clapping for Lenin because they knew whoever stopped clapping first was going to get shot. That's affirming too. It's affirming in that way. But that's not a treatment. If the child was anorexic, nobody would say, "You look great, skip another meal." That would be affirmative care for anorexia. This is no different. If the child had started experimenting with heroin, nobody would say, "Well, it makes you feel really good. Here's another shot." That's affirmative care for heroin. Or let me pay all your bills while your life falls apart around you. That's called enablement, usually. That's what affirmative care is. But the way that they do affirmative care with children in social transitioning schools is grooming. Grooming them, not particularly to be sexualized, not particularly to become in a sexual relationship with an adult, but to become queer activists who want to tear down the idea of normal in the society and to separate their generation from all previous generations. The sexual abuse turns out to be tangential. It's a bonus for some of the people they bring in, or that worm their way into this system that has no guardrails against that, but it's not actually the deliberate purpose. The deliberate purpose is to make sure that the children never have a stable identity. They never know who they are, so that they can not only be sexually, gender, whatever, groomed, they can also be politically groomed through generative concepts learning, through social emotional learning. A lot of people have a mistaken impression that social emotional learning is just a new name for critical race theory where they're trying to hide it. False. It is the hypodermic needle injecting critical race theory and queer theory into your children. It is a psychological tool of manipulation that was developed to do this. The history of social emotional learning is a little bit ambiguous to me. One of its biggest early champions seems to me to have been probably a well-intended guy. His name is James Comer. Probably a well-intended guy. Did bad, like 3 case studies, decided it kind of works, and it kind of took off from there. For a while, it was being adopted by counselors in individual settings with kids who've been identified as troubled. Now it's teachers who are not counselors in untherapeutic or non-therapeutic environments, uncontrolled classroom spaces on groups of children in every single subject. It is no longer based in learning to take personal responsibility for your social and emotional life. It is based on what they call transformative. Put that on your list of words, by the way, Wade. Transformative means Marxist. It is now a transformative social and emotional learning that explicitly is meant to raise the critical consciousness, which is a Marxist consciousness, and how, through the Freirean generative concept codification, decodification method. Social emotional learning just happens to do so using psychological tools being misapplied by non-professionals who belong in prison for doing it. And I don't want to be like too much of a hard ass. The truth is, if a teacher is being compelled to do this, the person compelling them to do it should go to prison, not them. Just to be clear about that. So anyway, that's what's going on in our schools. That's why groomer schools are a thing. That's why groomer schools are Maoist. That's why groomer schools has a 100-year-long trajectory of Marxist theory for how to overthrow a strong society. And that's what we are in the middle of right now. And the purpose is to create a revolutionary red guard out of your kids, who, by the way, if they win, will be lined up and shot. Because they have no use for destabilizers after the revolution. They only need them before the revolution. So they're setting these kids up to fail. It is not to protect LGBTQ kids or identities whatsoever. Those people are being used as human shields. No lesbian or gay person I know wants to be associated with sexual grooming. 0 of them do, but they persist. So this is what's actually happening. This is what we have to stand up against. This is what the stakes are. They will take your children. They'll take your children from you psychologically and emotionally first. They'll take your kids away from you physically, and if they walk in front of a train, as Hegel said, history uses people and then discards them. That's his philosophy of humanity. That's the philosophy that Marx adopted to build this theory. That's the theory that the queer theorists adopted in order to create what they're doing to the kids. History uses people and then discards them. They play their role, they get discarded. Just like the feminist movement, which is why Leah Thomas is a swimmer. And all the feminists have to suck it up that women's sports is now going to be dominated by men. Because history used feminism and it has now discarded it. They're TERFs, which is a mega slur that sounds like a fuzzy animal. This is not hopeless. This is what we're up against. We have to stop it. Though Sloan was 100% correct. This can be stopped. It's literally stupid. The people implementing it are very strategic, and we shouldn't underestimate them, but they're dumb enough to do things like put billboards up that say that heart attacks are normal in children due to something or another. Climate change, I think, is what causes that. Little known effects of stress that cause 5-year-olds have heart attacks, weirdly, after they get some kind of shot. So they're not the brightest bulbs in the box, and in particular, their theory is outpacing them. The slippery slope is sliding out from under them too, and they're starting to freak people out, and people are starting to understand what this is. Pushback is totally possible. Of course, the end session, we're going to talk mostly about that, so I don't want to bog down, but I do want to let you know, people ask me all the time, James, what can I do? And the answer that I give them is, I don't know, what can you do? But you should do something. Maybe you're an investigative journalist and you do that. Maybe you got a degree in political science, which is otherwise useless, and you do that. Maybe you can read freaking Paulo Freire's books and understand them, and you do that. Maybe you just show up. Maybe you run the bake sale to pay for events like this to get people together. Maybe you coordinate something. There are a million different things you can do. I don't know, what can you do? But do it. Figure out what you can offer this and pick it up and do it. All hands on deck. And just like, the Soviet Revolution in Hungary won. 4 months later, it lost because parents stood up. I was told there are 2 ways out of a cultural revolution. Somebody like Putin takes power and starts killing all the journalists that are feeding the stream, or parents rise up because they realize their children are in trouble. Your children are in trouble. Our children are in a lot of trouble. We have to stand up. We have to take bold action. We have to take smart action. We have to remember basic premises, like in a society like ours, the most basic principle that must be preserved, since the things I've said are horrifying, and they will motivate people to do bad things, is that whoever uses violence first loses. You have to be willing to sue schools. You have to be willing to overturn school boards. You have to be willing to lobby your lawmakers to sever ties to federal education money, to abolish teachers' unions. These are the kinds of actions that will cut them off. Federal money comes with federal strings. Where do you think this is coming from? Almost all of it's coming from the UN, funneled through the federal government, tied to education money. That's where it's coming from. How do you stop it in North Carolina so North Carolina schools teach North Carolina values to North Carolina children? You stop taking federal money. If the state money is corrupted, you stop taking state money. These are the kinds of actions that have to be taken. The last thing I'll tell you is you must protect your children first. The school building is on fire. If the school building really was on fire, it's an ideological fire. If it was really on fire, you wouldn't stand around trying to figure out how to put the fire out. You'd go in, you'd get your kid out. Then, when your kid's in safety, you try to figure out how to put the fire out and rebuild the building. Get your children protected first. Absolutely crucial. Because if we lose the children, just like Lenin said, you give them 4 years with the kids, they plant the seed so deep you'll never get it out. Just like Hitler said, what are you? You'll wither, you'll pass away. But I have your children. I have the next generation. Protect your kids first. We can turn this around. We are turning this around. The Awakening in 1 year has pushed back a dramatic amount of effort that they put forth for 50 years, spending trillions of dollars to do it. And we're just a bunch of grassroots hee-haws showing up and trying our best without any clear strategy and barely understanding what has been happening to us. 1 year. So please, make the next year even stronger. Thank you for having me here.